Greetings, people of the internet. Welcome once again to Bowtie Talks. I, of course, am your excellent host, Luke Johnson, coming to you, as always, from my undisclosed location in Midwest USA. And Thanksgiving is over, which can only mean one thing: Black Friday. Nah, just kidding. That day's already passed. I, of course, am referring to Christmas, as we are now solidly in December, and I can tell you that just by judging the weather outside. I don't know where you folks live, but where I am, it's only 26 degrees on the day I'm recording this. And I thought now would be a good time to discuss one of the most recognized symbols of Christmas. No, I'm not talking about Jesus. No, I am referring to the jolly old man himself, Christopher Kringle, Kris Kringle, Saint Nick, Santa Claus, whatever you want to call him. That's right, Santa Claus. I will also dive into some of the mythos surrounding jolly old Saint Nick and the various traditions that have come from Santa Claus. Because many of the traditions, in true American fashion, come from many different countries. So please hold on as we take a sleigh ride into the legends of Santa Claus. I'm sure that most of you listening out there have probably at one time heard the lyrics, "Jolly old St. Nicholas, lend your ear this way," or perhaps another one, "Down with the chimney with good St. Nick." Those lyrics are from Jolly Old St. Nicholas, Lend Your Ear This Way, and Up on the Housetop, for those wondering. And I'm sure that some of you have thought to yourself, well, wait a minute, who was this St. Nicholas and what does he have to do with Santa Claus? Well, the answer to it is basically everything. Nicholas was a monk born sometime around 280 AD in Pantura in what is now Turkey. The legend says that Nicholas was a giving man and traveled the countryside helping the less fortunate and sick. St. Nicholas came from a wealthy family who left the bulk of their estate to young Nicholas when they died. He had always had the spirit of giving, took his inheritance and gave it to the less fortunate, and lived a life of humility. Also, December 6 marks the anniversary of Nicholas's death, which is also the feast day of St. Nicholas, and which is also the day this episode will be released. And as a result of his great works, many legends about his great deeds were born. One of the most famous is that he saved 3 sisters from slavery by providing them with a dowry so they could get married. How did he do so, he asked? Well, the legend says that he climbed on the rooftop of the house of the 3 sisters and secretly dropped 3 gold balls down the chimney into their stockings. And so, a Christmas tradition was born. And over the course of many years, St. Nicholas's popularity spread and he became known as the protector of children and sailors. Why, do you ask? Well, once again, we have to look to some of the stories surrounding St. Nicholas. While traveling to the Holy Land, St. Nicholas prayed for calm seas during a storm, and the waters were calmed. And on the return voyage back to Turkey, well, present-day Turkey, a sailor fell from the mast and died. But St. Nicholas prayed over him, and he was resurrected. And why is he the patron saint of children? Well, he was known for giving great gifts to little children. And so we see the origins of Santa Claus beginning to form. And the beginning of hanging stockings for gifts to be put in them. And don't get me wrong, I love candy just as much as the next guy, but I would really like to have some gold in my stocking, if anyone's listening, and I'm sure a lot of other people would too. And after many years, Santa finally appeared in the United States. Well, that is to say, St. Nicholas, towards the end of the 18th century. And soon St. Nicholas became the most popular saint in all of Europe, even after the Protestant Reformation, which, when the veneration of saints started to be discouraged, St. Nicholas still held a positive reputation, especially in Holland. And it is with that we begin our journey into the next chapter of the history of Santa Claus. When Dutch immigrants came here during the 1700s, they brought with them their legend of Sinterklaas, which was their word for St. Nicholas. In fact, Sinterklaas was a shortened form for Sint Nicolaas, which is Dutch for St. Nicholas. And Sinterklaas began becoming very popular all throughout New York. And in 1804, a man named John Pintard, a member of the New York Historical Society, distributed woodcuts of St. Nicholas at the Society's annual meeting. The background of the engraving contains the now familiar Santa images, including stockings filled with toys and fruits hung over a fireplace. And in 1809, Washington Irving helped popularize the Santa Claus stories by calling St. Nicholas the patron saint of New York. And as his prominence grew, Sinterklaas was described as everything from a rascal, quote unquote, with a blue three-cornered hat, red waistcoat, and yellow stockings, to a man wearing a broad-brimmed hat and a huge pair of Flemish trunk hose, quote unquote. And soon the term Santa Claus became anglicized to become Santa Claus, and so that is how the jolly old elf received his name. Now, as I said, the appearance of Santa Claus usually varied among some people, and for the today's standard version of Santa Claus, we have to look to an 1822 poem by a man named Clement Clark Moore, who was an Episcopal minister who wrote a long Christmas poem for his three daughters entitled An Account of a Visit from St. Nicholas, which would later become known as 'Twas the Night Before Christmas. Moore was initially hesitant to even publish his poem because of the frivolous nature of its subject. However, Moore was largely responsible for our modern image of Santa Claus as a right jolly old elf with a rather portly figure and the supernatural ability to ascend a chimney with a mere nod of his head. However, some of Moore's imagery was probably borrowed from other sources, but his poem helped popularize the now familiar image of Santa Claus, who flew from house to house on Christmas Eve in a small sleigh led by 8 reindeer to leave presents for deserving children. This was also the first appearance of Santa's reindeer. And many of you have probably wondered about the origins of some of the reindeer's names. Moore created them himself. However, did you know that Donner and Blitzen were not the names of two of the original reindeer? Donner and Blitzen were not in the original lineup of reindeer. In their place were Dunder and Blixen. That, with anyone wondering, that is thunder and lightning in German. Why the name change? Well, that is a story in itself. Although Clement Moore first took credit for the poem A Visit from St. Nicholas in 1836, some scholars now believe a Dutch New Yorker named Henry Livingston wrote the poem. There are many reasons. One, Moore reprinted the poem in an 1844 collection of works in which he altered the last two reindeer names to Donder and Blitzen. Donder and Blixen is a Dutch expression which means thunder and lightning, as I said previously. So no, that's actually thunder and lightning in German is Donder and Blitzen. Donder and Blixen is thunder and lightning in Dutch. I apologize for that. While Livingston spoke Dutch, Moore spoke German. However, it should be noted that the primary evidence that Livingston wrote the poem is primarily based on hearsay. Some members of his family claiming that they heard him recite the poem around 1808. Which was some years before it was actually published. However, no contemporary written record exists to prove Livingston ever claimed the authorship of the poem, and so his claims are mostly rejected by serious scholars. And the poem began a new trend in the United States because it popularized the hanging of stockings by the fireplace in hopes that Santa would fill them with goodies. Something very important to note, however, was during this time, Santa's appearance was never really standardized. You see, prior to a certain period in history, Santa Claus was shown as everything from a tall, gaunt man to a rather spooky-looking elf. And so I pose you this question. What do Santa Claus and the current mascots of the Democratic and Republican parties have in common? A famous illustrator and cartoonist named Thomas Nast was responsible for their current appearances. That's right. Thomas Nast created both the donkey and the elephant as symbols for the Republican and Democratic parties, and he drew the most famous version of Santa Claus that still stays with us today. For the story, I'd now take you back to the year 1862. The Civil War had begun, and the country was at war with itself. It was a dark time, with brother fighting brother and father fighting son in some cases. Said Nast was a cartoonist, and looked to his own heritage to present a new figure. Nast first drew the jolly old elf for the 1862 Christmas season Harper's Weekly cover and a centerfold illustration to memorialize the family sacrifices of the Union during the early and, for the North, darkest days of the Civil War. Nast's Santa appeared as a kindly figure representing Christmas. His use of Santa Claus was rather melancholy, however, sad for the faltering Union effort in which Nast so greatly believed. The first drawing in Harper's Weekly magazine showed two images that cemented the nation's obsession with the jolly old elf. He depicted Santa as a rather portly man with a white hair and beard. The first drawing showed Santa distributing presents in a Union Army camp, and the second illustration featured Santa in his sleigh and then going down a chimney. The center of the cartoon was divided into two separate circles. On one side, a woman praying on her knees against the tree. Mast would later create a more famous version of Santa in 1882 when he showed the jolly fat man in full color with a white beard, dressed in a red suit, and carrying a large sack of toys on his back and carrying a doll in his arms. I'd also like to take this opportunity to dispel any myths and rumors that Coca-Cola may have been behind the modern interpretation of Santa Claus, because, as you can tell by what I just told you, we have a political cartoonist to thank for it. However, that does not to dispel any connection between Santa Claus and Coca-Cola, because the company does have a storied history with the jolly old man. Santa began appearing in Coke ads during the 1920s, with shopping-related ads in magazines like the Saturday Evening Post. And in 1930, an artist named Fred Misen painted a department store Santa and a crowd drinking a bottle of Coke. The ad featured the world's largest soda fountain, which was located in the department store Famous Bar Company in St. Louis, Missouri. And it was used in print ads that Christmas season, appearing in the Saturday Evening Post in December 1930. And in 1931, the company began placing Coca-Cola ads in popular magazines, and an advertising agency executive named Archie Lee began working with the Coca-Cola Company and wanted the campaign to show a wholesome Santa who was both realistic and symbolic. So Coca-Cola commissioned a Michigan-born illustrator named Haddon Sandblom to develop an advertising image using Santa Claus, showing Santa himself and not a man dressed as Santa. And for inspiration, he looked to both the Clement Clarke poem, as I talked about previously, and the Thomas Nast illustration. So therefore, as you can see, Coca-Cola did not create the modern interpretation of Santa Claus. And now I'd like to talk about some of the origins of some of the activities that Santa does. For example, leaving coal in naughty children's stockings. That, believe it or not, has its origins not in Turkish lore, but rather Italian lore. Correction, both Italian lore and the legend of St. Nicholas. Now, although Santa Claus is the figure most often associated with Christmas, in most countries, in Italy, they have La Befana. Now, La Befana is a witch who is said to go down the chimney much like Santa Claus, and to naughty children would give pieces of coal that she would find in the chimney and in the fireplace. However, in traditional Dutch folklore, Sinterklaas has an assistant named Black Pete, who also came down the chimney and would place gifts in shoes left out near the fireplace. And to the naughty children, he would leave pieces of coal. So once again, we have two cultures coming together to form something new. Ah, man, you gotta love those Italians. They gave us pizza and a lot of other good things. And why do we leave milk and cookies out for Santa? Well, that actually goes back to the days of the Great Depression. It was a time when many families struggled and Christmas was a tight spot. The families would ask their children to leave milk and cookies out for Santa to thank him for bringing gifts. And with that, I would now like to say Merry Christmas for listening, and I would also like to thank the Coca-Cola Company, Syracuse.com, WhenToChristmas.com, the Smithsonian Magazine, and the History Channel, and KSTM News for the information that I use to make this podcast. Goodbye, and God bless.